But today we're going to do something different. We had a YouTuber actually respond to one of our videos, and we really appreciate him. His name is Philip Arm. He wrote us, asked us. We said, sure, great, go for it. He sent us the link. We watched it, and I wasn't initially, Lacey hasn't seen this yet, just FYI. But I watched it, and initially I was like, oh, we're not going to bother responding. But then it got, within a couple of minutes, it got kind of wild. And so I thought, okay, I'll watch the rest of it. And so I watched the rest of it. And he kind of inadvertently brings up a lot of stuff that Lacey and I have complained about for months. We just never have enough time because we only have enough time for our schedules to do one 90-minute show a week. That's all we got, because they take a lot of prep time too. It's not like, it takes at least 5 to 10 hours of research, depending on the episode, right? So for us, it's kind of like, wow. And so he brought up a lot of stuff that we have all this extra research we never get in because we're trying to keep it tight. But he brought up this stuff, so I thought, well, we'll just go over his video today because he inadvertently steps into a bunch of this stuff. He's talking about it like it's this guy. This guy has made it clear it's an average of Americans. So we're talking about this 90 to 100 million people, okay? Living without a car is not necessarily feasible. That's why it's factored in, and this is why. So even MIT factors this in. The car is a necessity for most Americans to work. Not all, but most. And this is why. So when we go ahead.
The town I grew up in is a perfect example. I grew up in a town in the Midwest, and it was one of the bigger towns in the state. And it did have city buses. There were 4 bus routes, and they did a pretty good job of covering the 4 quadrants of the city, but those buses basically stopped by 4 or 5 o'clock, like the end of the school day. Basically, a lot of people's kids took those city buses to get, to their schools and home from their schools, etc. If you were reliant on those buses for your employment, I wouldn't say impossible, but it would have been a real struggle.
Well, right.
Real struggle.
So let's look at this. So this is Pew Research, and they're looking at people that work in urban, suburban areas versus rural, okay? So rural areas, it's about 14% of the population. So about 46,500,000 people live in rural areas. According to census.gov, about 59.2% of those people are working. So about 27.5 million workers in rural areas. Now, oftentimes in rural areas, you don't have transit. So you almost have to have a car, right?
I was in a unique situation in this particular, town in the Midwest that we had any buses at all. We were the minority that had buses. Most of the other towns in that state did not have those systems at all.
Yeah, the town I went to junior high in was a farm town. There's no public transit. You had to walk or ride your bike everywhere, and it took forever.
Right.
Because that town was spread out as a farm town. Anyway, Americans live in urban, suburban areas, okay, are about 86% of the population. So about 285, almost 86 million people live in and around cities, okay? And 64.2% of those people are working, so about 183.5 million people work in urban, suburban areas. Now, to understand this, if a lot of people live in the suburbs because it's a little bit cheaper, or they live in towns outside the city because it's cheaper, and they drive and commute to work, right? Which means they're in traffic a lot, their gas bill's higher, they have to pay for parking and all that stuff. But a lot of people can't survive without a car, especially if you have kids, because you got to drive your kids to daycare or school or whatever it is, right? It makes it incredibly difficult. And if you're trying to take a bus on what would normally be a 20-minute drive, it could take you an hour and a half to 2 hours, depending on your transit system. So now you're looking at commuting an extra 3 to 4 hours a day. That's 15 to 20 hours a week. That's like you're spending a part-time job on the bus, just trying to get home and to work. I mean, so yeah, when they factor this in, they're factoring in as it's a necessity for a lot of Americans. On top of that fact, I think 90% of Americans actually drive, commute. Some of that's by choice and some of it isn't, but just to dismiss all this, like, well, you don't have to have it. or this guy doesn't have to have it. It doesn't mean that when we're talking about 90 to 100 million people, that applies. And it doesn't to the vast majority. And that's the big problem, is that, once again, they think we're talking about one guy. They don't think we're talking about 90 to 100 million people. And it's worse for most of those people than this scenario the guy's given. But that was the initial gag. But you see how Phil fell right into it, just like they did.
Right. Right. And this TikToker is representing that literal median number.
The high.
We have to realize, right, that literal median number, when you have to realize that the 50% of the population is at or below that number. So it's a very slim number of people who are at that number. Right.
You know, maybe 5 or 10 million at most. Discretionary money. He has no fun money.
That is a good point. I actually love this. I love the idea of putting discretionary money as an actual line item in your budget. Maybe on a whim you want to take your girlfriend or your wife out to like an expensive sushi restaurant or something. It's a great idea to have a line item in the budget to know how much money you can spend on whatever the heck you want.
This is all just basic survival without medical care or any debt.
This budget is not basic survival. Rent is basic.
Okay. But it is according to MIT. Right? Now, we didn't bring that up, so he doesn't know that, so I'm not going to knock him for not knowing that. But the bottom line is, we just covered why. This is the basic things you need to be able to work and live. Basic survival in the U.S. Right? Now, if you want to get down to basic survival, Rambo in the woods, yeah, you're right. This is not basic survival. If you want to get to, do you want to have a job and a place to stay and food in the United States on average? Yeah, this is basic. It depends on where you want to draw that line. If you want to get to whatever, that's fine. But what we're talking about is have somebody who can work and survive in the U.S. That's it. Nothing else for them, just the ability to do those two things. So yeah, it's a survival budget on that sense. If you want to talk about the guy in Botswana, we can. Yeah, he's probably doing more basic survival, but he's probably lost kids to fucking pneumonia, which doesn't happen here that often. Lose his wife in childbirth or something.
Survival. Groceries, yeah. Electric, yeah. Water, of course. Vehicle payments, not basic survival. I agree that transportation is basic survival, but basic survival does not mean buying a car you can't afford, you know, taking out a loan to drive a car that's just too expensive for you at this moment in time. Yeah, Jack.
But but if you don't get the job. You can't do the job. That's the thing. I mean, once again, he's talking about himself or this guy. He's not thinking about 90 to 100 million people, which is what
sure. And in all fairness, I'm so not into the auto loan thing. I've never owned a car. I've never had an auto loan, and I don't like them. So I'll put myself out there as one of those. But I recognize I primarily lived in cities where I could buy a mass transit pass on a monthly basis and get to and from pretty much wherever I needed to using that. And that's not necessarily the scenario for everybody.
No.
And a lot of people really had to get a loan in order to get themselves started on a car situation. I mean, maybe when you get a follow-up car, maybe you can position yourself to where that's a cash car, and I think that's fabulous. But we're also not talking about one human being here. We're talking about a whole lot of them.
Right. Well, like when I started out my first time as a financial advisor, right? And you're trying to get clients, which means you're going around and you're doing a ton of seminars. You're meeting people. You're doing house calls. I had to buy a car. And you don't want to buy a cheap car or a piece of crap used car because, oh, yeah, trust me with your money while I'm driving around in a freaking beat up jalopy, right? No, you got to buy a car that looks like you're doing okay. It looks like you know what you're doing. Otherwise, people don't trust you. It's Worthington's Law, they assume. They assume you're poor.
I don't know. I'm not your average person, but I might trust you more if the car was crappy, because I'm the person who'd be thinking, that guy's smart. He's putting his money somewhere that's not that car.
Well, tip for you guys, young financial advisors: buy something that's like middle of the road but nice, right? You buy like, you get the guy that leases the Mercedes, then your clients are going to think, what the fuck is he doing with my money that he's driving around in a Mercedes? As opposed to you cruising around in a Buick, they're like, okay, he's practical. I get it.
Right. They're like, it's a decent car. He's being practical. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we're going to go ahead and skip ahead a little bit because this is just more of this generic stuff. But he gets on with